Let me tell you first, I've had some ear infection, which makes it impossible for me to use my right hearing aid. So my hearing is a little compromised, but that will hopefully not be a problem. I want to also tell you in advance that these remarks are 30 minutes long. And that's long. But I want you to know that it will end. And I hope that you will trust me that I cut out fully 2 hours of material out of compassion for you. We'll also leave up to you what we do at the end of the service. Audrey's suggestion, which I think is a good one, is that perhaps we could get coffee and then come back and talk. But I'll leave it up to you. If you'd like to talk at the conclusion, that would be fine. I would also like to mention that we will be talking briefly at the end about the Humanity Project, which is a new project we're doing in town on these issues. And I'm very pleased to say that some of our colleagues from that project are here. Laurie Snyder and Daisy Fraser and Polly Miller, and of course our own Scott, what's his name, Rodman, and Margaret Jarrett. We're very, very pleased that you're with us this morning. Okay. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. How our missing history created today's racial tensions and what we can do about it, or why it's important to preach to the choir. The title of these remarks has 3 parts. The first part is the second of our 7 UU principles, which guide our searches for a fulfilling and moral life. That is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and that speaks for itself. The second part is what I want to focus on today, the issue of our missing American history, the history that never made it into the textbooks that provided for most Americans the sum total of what they know about our history as a nation. And third is about the old gentle chastisement we're all so familiar with. Well, you know, you're just preaching to the choir. I believe that, as it turns out, there are 2 reasons why it's important to preach to the choir. I'll start these remarks with the first and conclude them with the second. So, we don't usually defend preaching to the choir. We understand there are people who simply don't need to be convinced. Absolutely true. However, the first reason that it's important is this. The choir doesn't know nearly as much as it thinks it does. And I say this with all humility because I am a member of the choir. And before I started researching this topic in more depth a few months ago, I had some confidence that I had a pretty good grasp of the historical realities of the lives of people of color. I was wrong. I knew, as you did, the broad outlines of the history of slavery and Reconstruction, and we're probably among a minority of the population who know some of the specifics of Jim Crow laws and their impact. We probably knew something, and maybe some of the horrendous specifics, of how American governmental policies savagely all but wiped out the native Indian population, the original inhabitants of this land. We not only nearly wiped them out, we wiped out, or tried to, their history, their languages, and their culture. We've also heard, of course, about the exploitation of Chinese immigrants, especially in building the railroads across the country, and the old and still current issue of Mexicans and other Latino peoples coming north to find work, and of their ongoing exploitation in our workforce as well. All in all, having invited ourselves into this country that we now call ours, we've gone on to not be very welcoming to later newcomers. The verse on the Statue of Liberty that we all know, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," must be seen now as ironic at best. The verse concludes, "Send these, your homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." I started thinking about all of this recently, especially after the violence in Baltimore, which was sparked by the death of Freddie Gray and one of the many instances in recent months of unarmed black men being killed by police. There was looting in Baltimore, some buildings were burned, and people were very angry. The reaction of many of the nation's white population was something like impatient puzzlement. What's the matter with them? After all, slavery ended 200 years ago. Why don't they just get over it and clean up their neighborhoods and get jobs? Well, clearly there is widespread, almost comprehensive ignorance, and I do mean ignorance, as in lack of knowledge, of what has happened to people of color in our country, of the actual realities of their lives. Some part of that is probably that finding out isn't a priority for most people. It just isn't of sufficient interest to them. But we did all go to school, got a basic education about things including American history, and there is the rub. What the great majority of Americans know about our history, they got from classroom textbooks. And those textbooks never included the grittier realities of American life, the practices and policies that were often ugly, even shocking, that have led to current realities. And as I thought about this, it seemed to me that we cannot ever come to understand each other as long as we're operating on the basis of inadequate or false information. So for starters, why isn't that information in the textbooks? Primarily because it isn't pretty. It doesn't present a picture of the America we and school boards and politicians like to present. The fields of waving grain, the proud flag, the brave soldiers, the happy families, the perfect land behind the golden door. So because it doesn't fit that image, they leave it out, or they whitewash it. Well, they whitewash it. It isn't uncommon to do that. Most countries do, to some extent at least. But when you have a critical problem, as we do, with racial misunderstanding and racial tensions, and the ongoing negative impact on the lives of people of color, we no longer have the luxury of covering up those realities. For starters, because prior to slavery, the colonies did employ indentured servitude, which was usually for a period of time, at the end of which the servant would be released. And because with the beginning of slavery, there was sometimes confusion as to whether an individual was an indentured servant or a slave, the Virginia General Assembly removed all doubts with this provision in its laws in 1705. Quote, all servants imported and brought into the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, and in correcting such slave he shall happen to be killed, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. Unquote. Slave owners went through extraordinary logical contortions to justify their enslaving people who were very obviously human beings. And a myriad of alleged scientists, craniologists, eugenicists, phrenologists, and social Darwinists at every educational level offered them absolute scientific proof that these people were inferior, indeed less than human beings. Kenneth Stamp's definitive book on slavery, The Peculiar Institution, an old book, but a very good one, provides a classic example. A Louisiana doctor, Samuel W. Cartwright, in the early 1800s attributed slaves' bad work habits to a disease particular to Negroes that he called Discathesia ethiopica. An African so afflicted was apt to do much mischief, which appeared, quote, as if intentional, unquote. This, wrote the doctor soberly, quote, was entirely due to the stupidness of mind and insensibility of the nerves induced by the disease, unquote. Also, according to Dr. Cartwright, there was a second disease peculiar to Negroes, which he called drapetomania, the disease which caused Negroes to run away. He saw this, quote, as a disease of the mind that with proper medical advice could be cured, unquote. So-called slave codes governed the behavior of enslaved individuals. Virginia's slave code served as a model for the slaveholding states, so this provision was widely observed throughout the South. The law stated that slaves needed written permission to leave their plantation, that slaves found guilty of murder or rape would be hanged, that for robbing or any other major offense, slaves would receive 60 lashes and be placed in stocks where his or her ears would be cut off, and that for minor offenses, such as associating with whites, slaves would be whipped, branded, or maimed. One historic event in 1857 precipitated what has been called the worst Supreme Court decision in our nation's history. And when you hear the language of Justice Roger B. Taney's decision, I think you'll agree. This was the infamous Dred Scott case involving an enslaved man who had been taken to free states and territories and attempted there to gain his freedom. These are the words of Justice Taney, quote, African Americans had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it, unquote. Those are all his words. It's also important to note here that according to Harold Meyerson in an article in the recent American Prospect magazine, quote, the slave economy of the South dominated the antebellum American and indeed much of the European economy. The Industrial Revolution, which first emerged in the cotton mills of Manchester, England, depended almost entirely on the product of the slave South. The invention of the cotton gin in this nation and creation of water and then steam-powered mills in the English Midlands and in New England provided the technological wherewithal for the breakthrough. But no less important was the forced exile of Native Americans from the lands that were to become Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, known to Indians as the Trail of Tears, a shocking story we all need to learn because it was wiped from the pages of our history books. In addition, there was routine use of physical abuse to compel slaves to become steadily more productive in their planting and picking cotton. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution ended the practice of slavery, and the South was no longer able to continue that practice, they instead instituted others that would, in effect, maintain their control of the now freed people so that they could continue to exploit them economically. One part of that process was to institute the Black Codes, which simply replaced the slave codes. These were laws passed by southern states in 1865 and 66 with the intent and effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. In addition, many states required blacks to sign yearly labor contracts that left them little better off than in slavery. If they refused, they risked being arrested as vagrants and fined or forced into unpaid labor. In the interests of time, I have to skip over the politically complicated and very important history of Reconstruction and move to the establishment of Jim Crow laws. This from Dr. David Pilgrim, professor of sociology at Ferris State University in Michigan, which maintains a Jim Crow museum. Now, as you hear this, imagine that you are a black person living in the South. Jim Crow, end quote, Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. The Jim Crow system was undergirded by the following beliefs or rationalizations. Whites were superior to blacks in all important ways, including but not limited to intelligence, morality, and civilized behavior. Sexual relations between blacks and whites would produce a mongrel race, which would destroy America. Treating blacks as equals would encourage interracial sexual unions, and if necessary, violence must be used to keep blacks at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Jim Crow laws excluded blacks from public transport and facilities, juries, jobs, neighborhoods. Unfortunately for blacks, the Supreme Court helped undermine the constitutional protections of blacks with its infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, which legitimized Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow way of life through the infamous doctrine of separate but equal, which said, of course, that separate facilities for blacks were legal as long as they were equal. Jim Crow required separate hospitals for blacks and whites, separate prisons, separate public and private schools, separate churches, separate cemeteries, separate public restrooms, separate public accommodations. Atlanta courts kept two Bibles, one for black witnesses, one for white. In most instances, black facilities were grossly inferior. One author referred to them as ostentatiously inferior. In other cases, there were no black facilities, no colored public restroom, no public beach, no places to sit or eat, no parks, and of course they were not allowed to use the white parks. Although Jim Crow operated by law only in the South, in the North, unwritten rules barred blacks from white jobs in New York and kept them out of white stores in Los Angeles. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which revived in 1915, used venom and violence to keep blacks in their place and were part of a clear and unambiguous campaign of terrorism. I will not go into the long and ugly history of lynching except to say this. George Frederickson, historian George Frederickson in 1971 said, quote, "Lynching represented a way of using fear and terror to check dangerous tendencies in a black community considered to be ineffectively regimented or supervised. The victim was an example of what happened to a black man who tried to vote, or who looked at a white woman, or who tried to get a white man's job, or for no reason at all. In addition, lynchings were often advertised in advance as a spectacle and social occasion, which was attended in large numbers by families who picnicked during the event. Often, local photographers took pictures of the proceedings, which were then sold as postcards. Unfortunately for blacks, sometimes the mob was not satisfied to murder a single or several victims. Instead, in the spirit of the pogroms, the organized mass executions of Jews in Russia and some other places in the 19th century, the mobs went into black communities and destroyed additional lives and property. Their immediate goal was to drive out, through death or expulsion, all blacks. The larger goal was to maintain at all costs white supremacy. Ira Katz-Melton, in his excellent book, When Affirmative Action Was White, said, "Private terror combined with public law and enforcement to make this political system authentically totalitarian," unquote. Jim Crow laws remained in place in most of the South until 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. And the rest of the Jim Crow laws fell with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, a mere 50 years ago. I remember it well. Yet another aspect of America's treatment of people of color relates to the issue of immigration, in particular the new immigrants, those who came in the second wave of immigration after 1890. Before that time, most of the immigrants were from Northern and Central Europe. After it, primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. These people were not black, but in the eyes of most Americans, they were certainly not white enough. This led us into one of the more bizarre chapters in our history, that is, categorization by race. In Working Toward Whiteness, How America's Immigrants Became White, author David Rediger tells us that, quote, "From the first Congress in 1790, the law required that an immigrant seeking citizenship be a free white person, a standard which held into the 20th century. That, however, was not easy to determine. Although, in fact, race is a complete fiction as a determiner of anything, including any kind of ability, indication of character, intelligence, etc., the categorizations have been many and varied throughout history. In Working Toward Whiteness, Rediger says that racial categorization in America was messy, which has to be some kind of an all-time understatement. We are accustomed to think of race, if we think of race, as three groups, basically, based on dominant skin color, hair color and texture, eye shape, etc. Yet in 1924, an exasperated U.S. Supreme Court, hearing a case on race and naturalized citizenship, complained that various scientific authorities placed the number of races at between 4 and 29, which was an improvement over the situation in 1888 when, according to experts, there were between 2 and 63 races. In 1924, the J. Walter Thompson Company, a major advertising firm, grouped Americans, Assyrians, Greeks, Persians, Syrians, Turks, Albanians, Lets, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, and Hindus together racially in a memorandum to employees. You have to wonder what the memorandum was about. Italians were often considered black. During a debate over how to disenfranchise blacks and which whites might be deprived of the vote at the Louisiana State Constitutional Convention of 1898, which all former Confederate states had to hold in order to regain acceptance back into the Union, some attendees at the convention acknowledged that the Italian skin happens to be white, even as they argued for disenfranchisement. But others held that, according to the spirit of our meaning when we speak of white man's government, the Italians are as black as the blackest Negro in existence, unquote. The insistence on white superiority and preservation of alleged racial superiority were at the heart of the phenomenon. From Rediger, again, quote, however ill-specified, race functioned to distribute the right to full citizenship and access to good jobs, unquote. New immigrants were immediately taught the language of hate, learning to use guinea, greaser, and hunky, not honky, hunky as in bohunk or bohemian, as well as, of course, nigger. And I had to discipline myself to use that word because I thought we cannot be too delicate to hear the word that they heard all the time. He goes on to say that the tragedy, quote, the tragedy arises from the knowledge that U.S. realities were brutal, effective teachers of racial division, and immigrants were ready learners. Quote, it is quite remarkable, the New York Age magazine editorialized during that time, how easily foreigners catch on to the notion to treat African Americans disdainfully and contemptuously. And eminent historian John Higham observed that, quote, native-born and Northern European laborers called themselves white men to distinguish themselves from the Southern Europeans whom they worked beside. New immigrants were regularly beaten, their homes raided, Italians were lynched, and Chinese workers were killed. Under the circumstances that some new immigrant workers still attempted to fight the Jim Crow world they lived in and work with black American workers as well as other immigrants designated as non-white was remarkable. A few incidents from Rediger's book. Quote, in a Mississippi town, whites wrecked an Italian-American restaurant and drove away its owner after he defied Jim Crow law by serving a black customer. After a Louisiana lynching of 3 Italians in 1896, so many African Americans showed up to mourn that local whites fretted about the possibility of interracial revenge. And the Italian socialist magazine Il Proletario denounced not only the lynchings, but also the Republic of Lynchings, branding the rulers of the United States the savages of the blue eyes. In 1928, a Polish paper denounced the adoration of all things Nordic as malignant and harmful, just as was the German Deutschland über alles, or Germany over everyone, German exceptionalism. And yet, the need to have jobs and feed families and the skill of American employers at dividing and conquering their workers of all colors ultimately broke down almost all of the attempts at seeking common ground and mutual support among workers of different colors. There are countless heartbreaking examples of how that bitter dynamic played out, but again, time doesn't allow me to include them here, though I would recommend reading Rediger's book, Working Toward Whiteness, How America's Immigrants Became White. By the way, on the table in the back with the refreshments, I have a small bibliography. You know, it's an academic compulsion. It's just some of the sources that I use that I thought you might be interested in taking a look at. It is important to note here, too, that many whites in the South were also extremely poor themselves. But again, the divide and conquer strategy worked well to convince them that while they may be poor, at least they were white, and therefore superior to all blacks. In service of that attitude, many poor whites were more than eager to keep blacks in their place through intimidation and violence. The Jim Crow South had a major ally in the United States Congress, which was for many years controlled by Southern representatives. Because Southerners held the Republican Party responsible for the Civil War and Reconstruction, Southern politics became exclusively and rigidly Democratic. No Republicans need apply. That's the solid South. Because there was no competition for congressional seats, Southern legislators were in office for a long time, thereby gaining seniority in the Congress and thereby controlling key congressional committees. They were extremely powerful, and little legislation, if any, got through the Congress without Southern approval. Consequently, legislation that might have helped improve the lives of black people was either defeated or modified in such a way as to gain Southern legislators' acceptance. An example, in 1948, when the Congress was debating the Fair Labor Standards Act, Florida Representative James Wilcox said this: "There is another matter of great importance in the South, and that is the problem of our Negro labor. There has always been a difference in the wage scale of white and colored labor. So long as Florida people are permitted to handle the matter, the delicate and perplexing problem can be adjusted. But the federal government knows no color line, and of necessity it cannot make any distinction between the races. We may rest assured, therefore, that when we turn over to a federal bureau or board to the power to fix wages, it will prescribe the same wages for the Negro that it prescribes for the white man." Now, such a plan might work in some sections of the United States, but those of us who know the true situation, that is that it just will not work in the South. You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it, unquote. Other Southern legislators condemned the Fair Labor Standards Act as comparable to anti-lynching legislation, which of course they also opposed. South Carolina's Cotton Ed Smith opened his speech in the Senate with an attack on anti-lynching legislation. He said, quote, "Every senator present knows that the anti-lynching bill is introduced for no reason in the world than a desire to get the votes of a certain race in this country, saying that the bill at hand, that any man on this floor who has the sense enough to read the English language knows that the main object of this bill is, by human legislation, to overcome the great gift of God to the South," unquote. Again, I have to shortcut this section because the history goes on, but you need to know that it was Southern legislators in control of key congressional committees who insisted that Social Security, one of the greatest benefits to working people and the elderly in our history, should exclude farm workers and domestics, which of course meant that significant numbers of black people were left out of Social Security's protections and benefits. Similarly, the GI Bill, which many have called the greatest piece of legislation ever produced, gave a great boost to returning veterans after World War II. It lifted an entire generation into the middle class, and as it was written, it was entirely racially neutral, except that Southerners managed to write into the legislation that it had to be administered locally, and you know what that meant. While white veterans enjoyed the benefits of college education, help with home mortgages, and other financial and other kinds of support, the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, we don't know for sure, of black veterans received little or none of the nation's largesse. Note, 2.5 million African Americans did register for the draft, but many were not allowed to serve because of restrictions caused by a segregated military, which was governed by Jim Crow. You know that if I included in these remarks the civil rights movement, we'd be here for another hour. But we need to say that this was a movement launched, the civil rights movement was a movement launched, organized, planned, and implemented by black people. For years, they daily put their lives on the line, were regularly intimidated, beaten, terrorized, and murdered. Yes, there were, without question, significant numbers of white people who went down to the South to help with voter registration efforts, went on marches, worked hand in hand with the black Southerners, and they themselves were also subjected to harassment and threats, and some of them also lost their lives, including James Reeb, a Unitarian minister who was killed in Selma after he went there to answer Dr. King's call to join the march. But it was a black movement, and it was their daily, dauntless courage, strength, determination, and intelligent management of the movement that finally brought enough pressure to bear to make possible some breakthroughs, though not nearly enough if you look at the situation today. So if you now hear someone say, hey, slavery ended 200 years ago, they should just get over it, you will know what the truth is. That black people have consistently and historically been denied education, and when it was not illegal, it was just difficult to get. And even when difficult to get, it was still usually markedly inferior, giving our stubborn and unjustifiable practice of basing school funding on the locality of the school district, ensuring that the wealthy would continue to enjoy excellent education and the poor will not. that black people have consistently and historically been denied access to good or even adequate health care, that black people continue to be denied employment because of prejudice and bias, even though such practices are now outlawed, because although no employer says, I'm not going to hire you because you're black, there are any number of ways they can get around that, and they do. That even now, there are concerted efforts to disenfranchise blacks through requirements for photo IDs and reduction of early voting days, that black men are shockingly overrepresented in prison populations, and the list goes on and on and on. I want to share with you one or two quotes that capture these realities better than my words can. Quote, Negroes are trapped as many whites are trapped in inherited gateless poverty. Such poverty is deeper and more distinctive. Negro poverty is not white poverty. The differences are solely and simply the consequence of ancient brutality, past injustice, and present prejudice. Unlike blacks, the white poor, many of whom escaped its shackles, quote, did not have the heritage of centuries to overcome, nor were they excluded because of race or color, a feeling whose dark intensity is matched by no other prejudice in our society. The speaker went on, men are shaped by their world. When it is a world of decay, ringed by an invisible wall, when escape is arduous and uncertain, it can cripple the youth and it can desolate the man. There is also the burden that a dark skin can add to the search for a productive place in society. Unemployment strikes most swiftly and broadly at the Negro, and this burden erodes hope. Blighted hope breeds despair. Despair brings indifference to the learning which could offer a way out. Negroes need the same chance as every other American to learn and grow, to work and share in society. To this end, equal opportunity is essential, but not enough. Not enough. Men and women of all races are born with the same range of abilities, but ability is not just the product of birth. Ability is stretched or stunted by the family that you live with and the neighborhood you live in, by the school you go to and the poverty or the richness of your surroundings. It is the product of 100 unseen forces playing upon the little infant, the child, and finally the man or woman. These words were spoken in 1965 to the graduating class of Howard University in Washington, D.C. by then President Lyndon Johnson. The speech announced the launch of his dramatic and innovative program to address some aspects of discrimination. It was the start of affirmative action. What happened to affirmative action since then is, as we know, another story. But at that moment, this man spoke with a passion and a depth of understanding that were unusual, even unprecedented in an American president. I think there's little doubt that his working relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King in the development of the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act affected him deeply. Dr. King would be assassinated 3 years later. In the remaining minute and a half, I would like to tell you, and this is truly just a thumbnail sketch, that our group, the Humanity Project, has decided to join together to do what we can to address these old and deeply rooted problems. The Humanity Project will launch in September and will attempt to help our community comprehend our history and the sources of the racial tensions we continue to live with. But most of all, we want to get to know each other as people, as our neighbors. So a part of the program will involve having participants who wish to do so partner with a person of another race, and over the course of a year, do something together twice a month, something that they would normally do anyway, to come to better understand each other. The program will include informational presentations and discussions during the year, along with the partnering program. We decided to call it the Humanity Project because it is about all of us. It is all humanity. But also because the concept of humanity encompasses the qualities of mercy, kindness, and community. We can discuss this all more over coffee. And finally, I said at the beginning of these remarks that at the conclusion I would give you the other reason it's important to preach to the choir, and that is this. Now the choir has to go forth and sing. I think.